Hi, class, and welcome back to Social Psych. Today we're going to cover Chapter 6, Attitudes. And to do so, we're going to start off by talking about what attitudes are. We're going to cover how we measure them, and then whether or not attitudes are really good predictors of behavior. But to get started, let's talk about attitudes in general. So, we all know what an attitude is in terms of non psych life. So when you think of somebody having a good or bad attitude, that's kind of how they're acting, their motivation, their emotions, things like that. But when we're talking about an attitude in terms of social psychology, this is really just the way that you feel about something, your evaluation of it, how it's positive or negative, how much you like or dislike it. And this can be for anything, right? So you see a thing, a person, a place, you hear about an idea, and that's going to end up making you feel some way about it. You like it, you don't like it. How do we get there? Well, it's through these attitudes or evaluations that we come up with whether we like, dislike anything. And if we want to organize an attitude, right? For instance, you see this little girl, my daughter, you are probably going to feel some way. And we can mark those kind of feelings, these components of an attitude, based on your emotional or affective response, your behaviors that you do towards this thing, and your cognitive responses. So the way you think about this. So I would guess that, right, when you see a cute little girl like this, you might think, oh, that's sweet. So you probably have a positive attitude about it. And with our attitudes, we break it down, as we mentioned, into three components: the affective component, the emotional component. You see something and it makes you feel a certain way. You have an attitude about, right, spiders. We probably don't like them, right? You've got a negative emotional reaction to them. When you see a spider, for instance, you're going to behave some way. If you're really scared, you're going to get away from it. And then cognition, you have certain knowledge about things like spiders, but this goes towards everything, right? This could be Nutella. This could be your perceptions of how much you like Stetson. This could be your perceptions of how much you care about yourself, right? You have attitudes about everything. So if you want to break down your attitude, if you want to sit there and think, why do I have an attitude about a certain something? Why do I feel this way? How do I evaluate this? You can break it down into these three components. But that still leaves a question: where do attitudes even come from? Well, we think about nature and nurture, we've got to admit that genetic components are clearly going to be a factor in this. So we do know that genetic twins typically have more similar attitudes than fraternal twins, than brothers and sisters. However, this isn't a one-to-one relationship. So our attitudes, our likes and dislikes, clearly come from our preferences based on genetics. I don't like spicy foods. That's probably part of where that attitude comes from. Another way that we can gain our attitudes is through our direct experience, through being classically conditioned. Many of us don't like the taste of cherry or strawberry medicine. Why? Because we were classically conditioned when we were kids. I tried it, I didn't like it, and so I am going to continue that feeling. However, we can also get our attitudes from other people. There's a lot of situations in the world where we're not sure how we should feel about something, so we might look towards other people and we might see if we get rewarded for liking these things or disliking these things, or if we get punished for liking or disliking these things. So attitudes are this kind of interesting thing in psychology. They're what we call a mediating variable that helps us to explain why we feel the ways we do about certain things. So we've talked about what attitudes are. How do we measure attitudes? Well, it's important to note something about attitudes before we dig into that. The fact that you can have an attitude that exists on two different levels. You can have an external or explicit attitude. This is something you consciously believe and you consciously hold. And this is more controlled processing. So this is more thoughtful processing versus implicit or almost automatic attitudes. So these are involuntary. They probably happen non-consciously and are automatic in this processing. Which of these is stronger? Well, it kind of depends. And my example of these two, right, is the idea that explicitly you might say out loud, I like my job. In which case, right, and if you truly believe that, you have that external, explicit, true attitude. However, you might Still smile at your work, put on that server smile, even though you hate your job, right? Your internal attitude might be that, you don't like being a waitress, waiter, whatever it might be. But your explicit attitude towards your customers might be, yay, I'm so happy. So it is useful to hold attitudes that, or to pretend that we have attitudes that maybe we don't actually do, because maybe it helps us to gain social rewards. But how do we measure them? How do we measure what people like or dislike? Well, there's two different ways. When it comes to measuring explicit attitudes, we can measure these directly. We can just ask people with Likert type scales, Likert, not Likert, right? So how much do you like your job on a scale from 1 to 5? That's a conscious measure of how much your attitude towards your job. On the other hand, we can always measure this indirectly. A really cool study asked people, white people specifically, to put two chairs next to each other because these people were because they and another participant were going to be having an interview, kind of talking to one another. They differed on whether they told the participant that the other person was going to be the same race or a different race. And so what we measured here to measure how, I don't want to say racist, but how kind of nervous you were about interacting with somebody of a different race versus the same race, was we measured how far away you set those two chairs to have this conversation. So if you were to set these two chairs close together, right, behaviorally, you're going to argue that, okay, maybe your implicit attitude towards race is a little bit less racist. We can always talk about physiological measures. We can have people hooked up to all kinds of things, looking at their brain waves. We can look at their skin response, other things of this. But the one that we're really interested in talking about today is the implicit attitude test, the IAT. So this is going to be done by measuring how long it takes you to respond to something. And so the implicit attitude test, or the implicit association test, you'll hear it called both, is going to be how measuring our kind of implicit associations between two different things. So it's important to recognize that these implicit associations are really not measuring necessarily your attitude towards something, but how well two things are associated in your mind. And you might be saying, what's the difference? Well, you might like peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. You might not like them. But regardless of how you feel, if I said peanut butter, what comes to your mind? What's associated with it? Jelly. And so there are certain associations we make in the world. I want to be very, very clear. I am not trying to promote any type of stereotype or anything, but I'm arguing that as this group of researchers who talk about the implicit association tests mention, is the fact that if you put people in a room and you ask them to do this response latency, so this timed task, and you ask them to put words together that are related to leaders and followers, as well as categorizing male or female. And so what we're doing here is looking at what the associations are between being male and being a leader, as well as being male and being a female, or being female and being a leader, and the reverse, being a male and being a follower versus being a female and being a follower. Again, I'm not trying to be sexist, but what we find here is that when you ask men and women, and anybody really, to categorize words and put follower on this side and men on this side, or leader on this side and men on this side, people overall are faster to put men and leaders together and women and followers together. Just in the same way people are faster to say peanut butter and jelly than they are to say peanut butter and pickles, for instance. So the idea behind this is we are associating certain things that we have, certain attitudes we might have. And so you can imagine that if you've ever taken a test like this, what happens is you are asked to look at different words, right? For instance, in this case, it's the word business. And then you're asked to make a judgment. Is the word business related to careers or families, or is this word related to male or female? Because the next word coming up might say a male name, Mike, or it might say a female name, Sally. In which case, if it's male or career focused, you put it here. If it's female or family, you put it here. But the one that we typically see this taken as is the racial IAT, the racial implicit association test. And what you do here is you show a face, a black or white face that is black or white colored, right? But the person is either black or white. And then you ask people to, in the same thing as this, if this is a black person, put it over here. If this is a good person, or if this is a white person, put it over here. But also, if you see any words related to good, put them over here. Bad, put them over here. We flip these, white and bad, black and good, as well as combine black and bad, white and good. What happens is the same thing we've seen previously, that when we are trying to look at the association between the words white and good, or excuse me, black and good here, it takes longer for people to associate black faces in the word good than it does to associate white faces in the word good. Am I trying to say that everyone's a racist? No, I want to be very clear about that. What I want to note about this is that this is suggesting that if you were to watch this video I have here, that we all are a little biased in some way, shape, or form. And if you were to take this test, right, you're going to see that. For instance, I have a bias towards a slight racial bias towards white individuals. Does that mean I'm a complete racist? No, it probably means that, well, who did I grow up around? I grew up in a very rural part of Northeast Ohio, in a farm town, to be honest. So when we talk about the implicit association test, we have to really be a little bit specific with our wording here so that we understand that all this is measuring is associations that have been made in our culture, in our world, things that we all have seen that aren't necessarily true beliefs that we have. So, right, the IAT is looking at associations between this object that you have an attitude towards and how you feel about it positively or negative. This is not a direct measure of an attitude. This is just a measure of how you positively or negatively feel about something like this. So it's very important to recognize that this is a useful test to kind of get an understanding of how people feel about something, but it is not the end-all be-all. Right? If you were to take this and find out that you have a slight racial bias, this doesn't necessarily mean you're the biggest racist on earth. This just means that depending on the place you've grown up, your culture, etc., you might have different associations than other people. Anyways, this is a whole can of worms that I'm going to quickly get out of here. So let's move on and talk about whether or not we're able to predict whether or what people do based on their attitudes. And so we're going to talk about a couple specific things here. Firstly, the question, do we think that attitudes predict our behavior? Is it true that we do one thing and say another? Yeah. Think about pollution. We all know that it's really important to recycle, to get rid of all of this pollution that we're causing, but most of us don't do anything. We know it is important to be honest. Americans value honesty. However, most of us admit to telling white lies. That goes against our attitudes. And then volunteering, being a volunteer. We all generally agree that volunteering, spending our time or money to help other people is an important thing. Why don't most of us do it then? So we can have these attitudes. We can agree these are good things, but that doesn't necessarily mean we will do that. Just because we have an attitude for or against something doesn't necessarily mean we engage in that behavior. The situation matters. I love to play video games, but I don't just sit there wasting my whole life. I still go to work and do those things. There's also this idea of social norms, something we'll talk about in a later chapter. This idea that I might think that, I might want to do whatever I want. Right? I might want to answer my phone in the movie theater, for instance, but I'm going to get in trouble with a lot of people if I do answer that. So our attitudes don't always predict our behavior. And one very famous study in the 1930s looked at this. And so there was a psychologist by the name Lapierre, and he crossed the country with a Chinese couple. And if you think about the timing of this, there was a lot of prejudice towards Asians, and he was really worried that he would be refused service across the country. Why? Because there was a lot of anti-Asian prejudice. And so what he did was he went across the country with these people, He visited 251 establishments. That includes like restaurants, hotels, things. And he walked in and he said, "Hi, I'm traveling with my two companions here. Can we get lunch? Can we have, a hotel room, et cetera, et cetera?" Only one of those 251 establishments turned them away. So everybody said, "Sure, okay," except one group. Now, the cool thing is, we saw what happened in person. We saw their behaviors when, basically I came to you as the shopkeeper and said, "Hey, can I bring my friends in here that I don't think you really like?" Most people went, "Sure, whatever." 6 months later, this guy, he doesn't bring them back, but he sends a letter to all of these companies. And he says, "Hey, I'm going to be traveling here in the next couple months." What he's already done. "I'm going to be traveling here in the next couple months with a Chinese couple. Would you allow us to stay at your hotel, eat at your place, whatever?" 92% of people said no. "No, you cannot. Just keep going." One said yes, and the rest either didn't send anything or, weren't sure. That's so different than what actually happened, right? Well, what we find actually is that there's not a lot of consistency between our attitudes and our behavior. The situation matters, right? So it's the fact of the matter that you can have your personal beliefs, but does the situation allow you to kind of engage in that? So another study found that the best way to predict behavior is this attitude something that's caused by direct experience? And a really interesting study looked at this, and right, if you were in this situation, how would you feel? So in Cornell in 1977, they let in too many students, and there were not enough beds to sleep in. And so what happened is some students had to sleep on cots due to housing shortages, right? So we don't have enough beds in the dorm for you, so we're going to throw you on a cot, and sorry. Nobody is happy about this. Not the people whose rooms are now filled with an extra person, not the people who are sleeping in some random room. Everybody's upset at this, right? Nobody's happy here. But only the people who were stuck on cots were willing to sign a letter to make change happen. Why? Because they're the ones affected by it. Right? When we need to think what actually matters, we look at how this is going to affect us. Certainly, we can feel that this is a crappy situation for everybody involved, but I'm not going to make changes unless it really is bothering me. It's not exactly a positive thing to think about. So when do attitudes predict behavior? Well, like a lot of things in this class, it depends. Is our behavior spontaneous or planned? If it's a spontaneous behavior, our attitudes are going to predict this if it's a highly accessible attitude. So the accessibility can be increased with more direct experience with an attitude and object. So for instance, if you are really thinking about ice cream, right? You are just like, "Man, I could go for some ice cream. I could go for some ice cream." You're more likely to have a spontaneous behavior of, "You know what, let's just go get ice cream," right? So that's going to be something because it is a highly accessible, it's right in the top of your mind. So accessibility is increased by experience with the attitude object. So the more experience we have with it, the more likely we're like to spontaneously consider doing this. On the other hand, we've got planned or deliberative behavior, thoughtful decisions. Chances are, right, you are not going to just all of a sudden spontaneously start studying for an exam. Well, this is all part of what we call the theory of planned behavior. And the theory of planned behavior argues that when you need to do a planned behavior, do something that maybe you don't want to do, study for an exam, for instance, how you get to do that behavior is through a behavioral intention, right? If I'm hungry, I just spontaneously go to the fridge and get food. But if I have to do something deliberative, if I have to study for an exam, well, how am I going to do that? Well, it's not just something that's going to happen. Well, a couple things that are going to happen is one, I'm going to have to focus on my attitude towards this behavior. Do I like doing this or not? Studying for exams? Probably not. So it's going to be a little hard to make me do this. We can also ask, what are the subjective norms? What is the normal thing to do about studying for exams? Study at least a little, right? So, if you think about how it would look really bad if you didn't study at all compared to everyone else, you're maybe going to be more likely to study. And finally, perceived behavioral control. Do you think that you can actually accomplish this? I like to think about this as well as like self-efficacy. Are you efficacious? Can you rise to the challenge? Can you study? Because if I think, oh, I'm too stupid, I'll never be able to do well on this exam, I'm not going to try. So, our theory of planned behavior argues that there are these three specific components: how we feel about what we need to do, how other people think we should deal with this, and then how we feel we're going to actually be able to accomplish this. So, I might not like studying, but I know it's important and I know that I can do well. So, fine, I'm going to go study. Another thing we can talk about is when we ask people if they're going to do something, it's really the level of specificity, how specific of a question we are going to ask. For instance, if I wanted to know if you were going to go to a basketball game, or in this case, a baseball game, I might ask a question like, what is your attitude towards Stetson's baseball team? Well, if you have a good attitude towards it, maybe you're going to go. But what if I asked you the question, what is your attitude towards going to watch a Stetson baseball game? If you're like, yeah, I have a really positive attitude towards that, that's more likely that this is going to happen. In one study, they asked women, what were your attitudes towards taking birth control? And then they asked them, were you taking birth control? And so what you notice is that when you just ask women, right, what is your attitude towards birth control? Positive, negative, whatever. Just at this very vague, very unspecific level, there is a positive correlation that the more positive your attitude towards having birth control is, the more likely you are to use birth control. But the more specific the question, what is your attitude towards using birth control pills in the next 2 years? Well, over 50%, right? The correlation's over a 0.5 here, that right, the likelihood of actually using contraceptives here is much better when we're focused on these specific measures. So if you want to ask somebody, right, what do you think about pollution? Well, it's bad. Okay, what do you think about, or what's your attitude towards recycling in your own home every week? That's going to be a much better predictor of whether or not this person's going to actually recycle, right? Now, it's important though, because we get attitudes and then we have to figure out why we feel them. So, right, a question, why do you love your significant other? Well, for me, I've been married to my wife now for 7 years. We've been together for almost 15. That's probably not the best question for me to ask, for me to justify why I have a positive attitude towards my wife. And in one study, we did this. We asked students about their relationship about their partner. And some students were asked, hey, how do you like your partner? Do you like them? And other people were asked, hey, give me all the reasons that you like your partner. Then afterwards, we asked people, hey, how satisfied are you in your relationship with your significant other? Then we checked 9 months later, were you still in a relationship? It turns out that your overall evaluations, just overall how you feel, not the specific things or the listing these, better predicts if you're going to be in a relationship 9 months later. So, what is this saying here? This is saying that maybe it's not the best thing to do to, start writing down a list of every good and bad thing somebody's ever done to you. Maybe it's better to just think about this bigger picture, right? So sometimes we misinterpret why we have this attitude. And honestly, it's very hard for us to predict the reasons that we feel the way we do here. So we've talked about predicting behavior from attitudes. What about the reverse? Predicting attitudes from behavior. So can we predict how you feel based on what you do? Yes. And to start off, we are going to talk about one of the most powerful mental forces that we have. And this is called cognitive dissonance. So if you are a person who likes music, you get this idea innately. So cognitive dissonance is the idea that just like in music, when we have a chord that sounds nice, three notes together, it sounds pretty. But if you just smash your fingers on a piano, it sounds ugly. It sounds dissonant, not consonant. So we're going to figure out what happens when mentally we have an attitude and a behavior that are not matching. And to study this, we talk about Leon Festinger, who joined this cult in the 1950s. And in this cult, the Seekers, they believed that a flying saucer was going to come down to Earth, it was going to flood the world, and those people were going to be saved. Now, Leon Festinger doesn't believe this, and he says, what is going to happen when the spaceship doesn't come? And Festinger believed that for the people who have been in this cult for years and years and years, they're not going to say, oh, I was wrong. They're going to say, I was even more right, even though the saucer didn't come. How is that possible? Well, people don't like to be bamboozled like this, is really the best way to do it. We like to think we're smart. And what happens when we find out that we did something very wrong? We don't like to accept that. So our behavior can influence our attitudes because we want to be consistent. The best example I can give is if I am a smoker, I'm not, I am going to know that smoking is bad, but I'm going to keep smoking. How am I going to handle that in my head? We're craving this cognitive consistency. We're motivated to be consistent with our thoughts, our feelings, and our behaviors. We want to, right? Like, I want to feel like I am a good person. I want to think I am a good person, and I want to do things that make me a good person. However, what happens when I like to feel like a good person, but I do something that maybe makes me not feel like a good person? Or in this previous example, what if I know smoking's bad, but I'm smoking? This is going to cause dissonance. This is going to cause that yucky feeling inside where there's an inconsistency between my thoughts, smoking is bad, and my actions, I am smoking. And so how am I going to fix this? Well, we need to figure out some way. And what's the best way to change? If I am smoking and I know smoking is a bad thing, how am I going to get rid of that bad feeling? Am I going to stop smoking? I could, but what am I really going to do? I'm going to say that smoking isn't that bad. And so this idea of having a belief in an action, right? So you've got your cognition or your affect, whatever you want to say here, and your behavior. That is going to lead, right, in the same way to an inconsistency, which is going to cause dissonance. You're going to feel, ooh, I don't like this. How do we get rid of that dissonance? Well, there's a couple ways. We can change our belief. Smoking's not going to cause me cancer. Well, now I'm not feeling bad about it. I can change my action. I'm going to stop smoking. That'd help, but it's not easy. Or I can change my action perception. I like to think about this one as kind of lying to yourself a little. I can change the perception of that action to me. Yes, I know smoking isn't good for me, but I do it to help me relax or change, right, the perception of why I do it. And so when we think about these cognitive elements, this knowledge, this belief, these attitudes that can be relevant to one another, right? We know safe driving is important, for instance. And we know that driving safe can reduce accidents. We also have a lot of different thoughts that don't matter, right? Like I like ice cream, but that doesn't matter about safe driving. What is more interesting is what happens when I know I'm supposed to be a safe driver, but I'm messing with my phone to change my Spotify song. Well, I know that that's bad, and that's causing this negative feeling. So what do I do with that? That's what we're talking about here. So let's back up and talk about this really cool study looking at this. So what we did in this study was we paid people to lie to a stranger. Do you think you'd be happier if how well do you feel you would feel after lying to a stranger? Would you be happier after lying to a stranger if I gave you $1? Or would you be happier if I gave you $20 to lie to a stranger? People mostly say $20. You'll feel a lot better about lying to them. Now, the real question is, what conditions would you change your attitude after lying to a stranger? So in this case, I'm not going to have us watch this video. Again, trying to avoid copyright claims. But if you type in Festinger and Carlsmith cognitive dissonance, you'll find this video. But what we are doing in this video is we are asking people to lie to another participant. They're going to do this really, really boring task where they turn pegs, like 100 pegs, and it takes a long time and it's not fun. This would be like asking you, hey, can you screw in 50 screws on this piece of wood? Okay, it's not really fun. Afterwards, the participants who did that were paid to lie to the next participant, just another person in the study. And it was, right, to make you feel a certain way. Because what are we doing here? We're making you feel dissonance. Lying's bad, but we've paid you for it. So, boring task is involved, turn these pegs, and then we ask you, hey, can you talk to the next participant and tell them that this is a really fun task? And so in the first condition, we just said, hey, can you tell them how you felt about this study, this control condition? So in the control condition, people didn't enjoy the study and they weren't willing to lie. So, you come in next and somebody says, hey, you're going to be doing this study and it's pretty boring. Another condition said, hey, if you, can you tell these people that this was really fun and we'll give you $1. The third condition, tell these people this was really fun and we'll give you $20. Afterwards, what we did was we measured how much these people who lied actually enjoyed the experiment. And look at what you find here, that people in the control condition, right, who didn't lie, did not enjoy this. They said this was a stupid thing. When we gave people $20 to lie, and we asked them, how much did you like this task? They said, it was fine. When we gave people only $1 for lying, a less amount of money, these people changed their minds and said, actually, this was a fun task. What? Why would you be more likely to enjoy it if you got paid less than if you got paid more? Well, think about it. The task was really boring, and I just told this guy that this was fun. And the top one, if I pay you a lot of money, there's no dissonance because your thinking is, I lied because I made a lot of money and I like money. Well, why would you only lie for $1? If you lie only for $1, you're going to sit there and think, well, why did I do that? Well, maybe the task really was a lot of fun. And so that's going to lead to more dissonance here. So giving people a small favor, right, making it or only rewarding them a little, makes them think that it is much more important to them. Another example of this, if your friend needed help moving and they offered you a slice of pizza and a beer or something, right, a small task, you are going to say, yeah, you know what? At the end, you're going to say, this was a lot of fun. I got to help with my friends. If your buddy gives you $500 to help them move, you're going to say, no, this wasn't a lot of fun, but at least I made some cash, because you can rationalize it out and say, yeah, that's for a different reason. The fact of the matter is, after we make a decision, we often have to justify this and describe why we feel this way, right? Maybe a question like, where should I go to college? What major should I pick? Should I go into a sorority or fraternity? Where should I live, right? You could imagine that if I moved down to Florida, so I'm going to say, boy, why would anybody ever live up in the north? But maybe if I lived up in the north, I would think, oh boy, why would anybody go down to Florida? It's so hot in the summer, right? The idea is you're having to figure out, did you make the right choice? And our minds are more or less programmed to say, yeah, and here's why we're just going to justify that as being correct. Now, a really cool study kind of showing this asked people about their beliefs at how well their horses were going to do at a racetrack. So if you've ever been to a racetrack, or if not, basically what we're doing is we're waiting right by the line for people to place their bets on a horse for who's going to win. So imagine that you are second in line, you're next up to pay for your bet, and we walk up and we ask you, hey, which horse do you want to bet on? We're just, curious. we're psychologists, we're doing a study, and they say, oh, I plan on bet on, this horse. We go, okay, cool. How confident are you that your horse is going to win? On a scale from 1 to 10, say. Then we asked some other people right after they paid their bet, right? So they can't take their bet back. They can't make a change now. That how likely is it, do you think your horse is going to win? So we asked some people before they placed their bets and some people after they placed their bets. Who is going to be more confident? People who have placed their bets already. Why? Well, you can only change two things, your behavior or your attitude. I can't change my behavior. I've got the slip that says I'm not allowed to change my bet. My bet has been placed. So, action, right? I placed my bet. Belief, I don't know if they're going to win. That's going to make me feel bad. How am I going to get rid of this? I can't change my bet. I can say, no, they're going to win. They definitely are. This isn't just in horse track racing either. This includes politics. You can imagine that most people, after they vote, are going to be more confident in their candidate as being the correct choice. So imagine how that's going to look on election day here. But I'll stop right there. So when does this actually occur? Well, if these are important decisions, if these are permanent decisions, things like, which college you're going to go to, or if you have two alternatives that are about the same, a Mac and a PC, right? They all do the same things, but you're going to be mentally kind of hardwired to think after you purchase a Mac or a PC that, that was the right choice. I chose the right one. The idea behind this is we are justifying our effort. We tend to increase our liking for something we worked hard to attain. And that's especially if that thing turns out to be unpleasant and boring. So for instance, like from my own life, I am going to justify loving my dog to death, even if she is a complete butthead, or my kid when she wakes me up at 3 o'clock in the morning to watch Sesame Street, or my wonderful experience in graduate school, right? All of these, I might look back and say, wow, I'm so glad I did that, even though it was bad for me. I love my dog. I love my kid. I'm glad I got my doctorate. But right, if I didn't, I might not be willing to justify that effort. So to rationalize this, an example of that effort justification, was this really fun study where we asked women to come to this psychology of sex discussion. So this Aronson, who's a student of Leon Festinger's, he recruited 63 young women to investigate the dynamics of the group discussion process, and the group was discussing the psychology of sex. Now, in order to make sure these students were as open as possible, what we did was we basically screened them to make sure they'd be willing to talk in here. And so the screening was either very severe, very mild, or there was no screening. So in the no screening, we just said, come on in. In the mild screening, we said, hey, we want to make sure you're able to talk about this stuff. And this was all over an intercom system, so you couldn't be seen. But right, we asked them, do you think you can talk freely about sex? Everybody said yes. So in the none condition, we said, all right, go on in. In the mild condition, we said, we're going to do a short embarrassment test to see how you do this. And so in the mild condition, you were asked to read words like prostitute, virgin, and heavy petting. In the severe condition, you were asked to say words like, pardon my French, fuck, cock, screw, and read 2 passages from contemporary sex scenes. Nobody likes doing this. Nobody wants to say that in front of a research assistant. The funny thing is, after everybody goes in there to listen, it turns out that this is about sexual behavior in animals. And because you showed up late, you're not actually going to discuss, you're just going to listen. So afterwards, we asked people, how interesting was this talk? Now, in the control condition, people thought it was pretty interesting. In the mild condition, people thought it was also, about the same. But when you were forced to read dirty words out loud, you are much more likely to justify that effort and say, oh, so this was all worth it here. So how does this work? Well, I'm embarrassing myself. And that group discussion was really boring. That dissonance is going to be here. So I got to get rid of that. So maybe I'm just wrong. Maybe it was really interesting, because why else would I have gone through all of that effort to do this? And so recognizing that if we're unable to justify the reasons we did something, if you can't justify it, you're going to have more distance. If I walked up to you and slapped you for no reason, right, why would I do that? Well, if I hated you, I'd have a good reason, but otherwise I'd be confused. Threat or obedience, if somebody is threatening you, right? If I told you that, you had to lie to this next person or I'll slap you, you're not going to feel as bad about lying. You're like, well, I had to. And one that actually increases dissonance, if you get to choose your behavior, if you get to choose your college major and then you don't like it at the end, you're going to feel dissonance here. The important thing to note is that when we feel this dissonance, we tend to ignore that information that goes against our attitudes. We selectively perceive it. We deny certain things. We just only focus on what fits our views. We can focus on what we are exposed to. We are only going to seek information that's consistent with us. For instance, if you are very interested in Stetson's sports teams, you are probably only going to look at information that says Stetson sports teams are great. You're going to ignore the information that says they suck. Selective attention, again, there can be lots of information around, but you're only going to pay attention to the information that agrees with you. If you have if you have an article that says Stetson sports team is doing great and a Stetson sports team is doing terrible, you're only going to focus on the one that says they're doing great. And selective interpretation, this idea that if we're not really sure how to take this information, we're going to change it to be as consistent, to kind of be as for us as possible here, right? You are going to choose the glass as being half empty or half full, depending on which you want it to be. So one thing we can also talk about this that goes with predicting attitudes and behaviors, something we've already covered previously, self-perception theory. This idea that sometimes we don't know our attitudes about certain things, so we look at our behaviors. I don't know if I enjoy watching sports, for instance, so, I'll look. Do I actually spend a lot of time watching sports? If I do, yeah, I must like watching sports. So this is going to be a useful way for us to kind of probe our attitudes, but one interesting thing we can do to help us understand how we feel about something is related to other people as well. And so this very fun study is great if you ever want to have children, because it helps you understand how to make them not do these bad behaviors. And so what we did was we showed some school children a set of 5 toys and asked them to rate how much they liked them, right, from most liked to least liked. So the researcher then said, cool, I've got to go for a couple minutes. You guys can play with any toy except your second favorite. We don't want to give it the first favorite, but we want it to be something they like. So they can still play with their first favorite toy, they just can't play with their second favorite toy. What we manipulated, though, was what we told the kid. For half the kids, they were put into a mild threat. Hey, you can play with any toy except your second favorite because I will be annoyed. Mild threat. The severe threat, half of the kids were told, hey, you can't play with this toy when I'm gone, because if you do, I'm going to be really mad, and then I'm going to go home and I'm going to take the toy away and I'm never coming back. Now, to a 5-year-old, this is intense, right? So what we do is we observe what children do. None of them play with the second favorite toy. They all listen. And then when we come back, we ask them, now how do you like the toys? Now, when we ask kids mildly, when we say, hey, don't play with this or I'll be annoyed, kids like them less, like the toy less. That second favorite toy. However, with a severe threat, kids inflate the value of the toy. They want it more, right? So this kind of is in the same way as fines and a slap on the wrist. It turns out that the mild threats are going to actually be better to get people to stop doing this than severe threats. Think about it, right? The thought of going to jail for the rest of your life doesn't necessarily stop people from doing bad things, but why is it that you might not, right? I don't think that, Speeding, for instance, if you were thrown in jail for the rest of your life for speeding, that wouldn't be as useful as if we, just fined you for speeding, things like that. So another topic we can talk about related to this and how we can see this is embodied attitudes, the fact that our bodies also give us cues as to how we're feeling. So one thing we can talk about is like this embodied cognition, the idea that if you are asked to smile or frown, that actually affects your emotional state. Not only that, if you ask people to do certain things where they are pulling good words towards them or pushing bad words away from them using a joystick, people don't like to pull bad things towards them. They like to push bad things away from them. This all goes down to the self-validation hypothesis. So if you've ever been in a situation where somebody's trying to sell you something, they might end up start nodding their head like this. And what happens is you might start nodding your head. What happens when you nod your head? Well, what is that telling your brain subconsciously? Well, it's a good thing because we nod when things are good. So this is going to say that actually, when we are nodding our heads, we are increasing our confidence about our beliefs. So you can sit there and go, I'm not sure how I feel about this exam question. And to a slight degree, the more you're nodding your head, you're going to say, oh, okay, I definitely agree. This is right. The final thing we want to talk about is kind of bringing all of this together and understanding how attitudes affect us more broadly. And so we don't just make rationalizations about ourselves and others, right? But we make rationalizations about the world. Typically, people follow what we call the just world hypothesis. From the time we've been very little, we've grown up with stories that say, right, people get what they deserve. Good things happen to good people, bad things happen to bad people. Is that the truth? Not always. Sometimes we can talk about this as well as the system justification theory, not just what people, right, that people get what's coming to them, but that the systems we live in, the American democracy, for instance, is desirable, it's fair, it's the way things should be. Why? Because I want to know that my society that I'm living in is the good society. We note that with this system justification theory, low-income groups often don't support taxing the wealthy, even though this would help them. And a fair number of women actually report that they don't deserve equal pay. Why? Right? Well, they are motivated to see this system as fair as it is. Not only that, people will use compensatory stereotypes, so compensating. So this idea that, right, just because poor people are poor doesn't mean that's a bad thing. People give this compensatory stereotype that even though you're poor, you're happy. Is that really the truth? Well, as we said in chapter 5, probably not. So when we want to rationalize our world as being fair, right, we can think about that when we look at what happens to other people. If my house gets robbed and you don't know anything else about me, you are likely to think, I wonder what he did to deserve it. On the other hand, if you are thinking about this in terms of the systems, this is system justification theory, the idea that, America, right, the American democracy is so much better than any other, in some way to justify the systems that you live in. So one major thing that can happen to us is the fact that we recognize we might die one day. We talked about terror management theory, this idea that when we think about the fact that we're going to die, it gives us anxiety. How do we manage to get out of the fact that we're dying? You can't. So what we can do is we can cope with death when it comes to mind. We can figure out how we can survive death even if we're going to die. And how can we do that? Well, we can think about what our systems, our society is going to do. So when we have mortality salience, the salience that, I might die one day, it tends to make people want to view the world as, this is the way it should be. And that I want to live through this. I want to live through this world. Now, there's a couple crazy manipulations asking people for mortality salience. But what we find here is that when you are put under this pressure of, oh God, I might die one day, people are hostile towards other countries. So you like America better than other people. People are more committed to their friends, their families, those who are like them, and afraid of others. And actually, men are more likely to report having more children, wanting to have more children after they've been reminded, hey, you're going to die one day. That's a lot. So we'll end on a nice happy picture here. But I hope you all got a lot out of this lecture, understanding how our attitudes affect us, how the world is kind of playing, or how those attitudes affect the way that we see the world, even. But as always, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. I hope you all have a great day, and let me know if there's anything I can do to help. Have a good one, everybody. Bye bye.